So you mentioned immigration, so let's get into immigration. In the Constitution, is there any mention of immigration? Professor Gulasekaram, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. To understand the role that our 50 states could potentially have in regulating immigration, I think we got to start with some basic questions, the answers for which may actually turn out to be quite complex. So let's get into it. What is federalism?
Thank you for having me, first of all. You started with a question that is huge, broad, has lots of different perspectives. But I think the simplest answer that one can give is federalism is the idea that power is allocated and authority is divided between different levels of government. So in the United States, our version of federalism, often called our federalism in legal literature, reflects the idea that governmental authority in the United States is divided between the federal government, the national government, constituted of Congress, the Supreme Court, the executive branch, and then the states, right? The 50 states underneath it. In a famous Supreme Court opinion, Justice Anthony Kennedy once said that the framers of the Constitution, quote, split the atom of sovereignty, unquote, between the federal government and the states. And so that's the idea of federalism. It's easy to state in those abstract terms, much more difficult and complicated to apply to contemporary.
And if I may stop you here, what you just shared with me is easy to comprehend. Why is this a complex issue then?
Right, because I think one of the reasons it's so complex is that abstract or general formulation doesn't exactly tell you what the metes and boundaries are of federal power versus state power. What do you do when states and the federal government are engaging in concurrent regulation in a particular area? Are there areas that are exclusively for state control, exclusively for federal control? The Constitution doesn't really provide very clear answers to all of these questions, and especially as our society, our nation, our country has expanded geographically. We've developed technologically, all of those things. These questions, these regulatory questions have had significant, there's been significant controversy and complication as to how to apply those general principles.
So if the Constitution doesn't clarify this, then this area is fraught for litigation, kind of like constitutional law issues left and right.
That's right. And this is why many types in many regulatory areas, you get questions over the extent of state versus federal power. This is not unique to, I know we're going to be talking today about immigration, but this is certainly not unique to the immigration sphere. Think about any area of regulation, products liability in torts, criminal law, environmental regulation. In all of these areas, you are going to get disputes over where federal authority might start and end and where state authority might start and end.
So you mentioned immigration, so let's get into immigration. In the Constitution, is there any mention of immigration?
It's surprising, I think, because immigration is so far at the top of our current national agenda, and occupies so much space in our political discourse. You would think that something so important would have that the Constitution would have lots of mentions of it. The Constitution never actually says the word immigration at all. The closest
for a nation of immigrants, this is not in our Constitution. That's interesting.
Right. The closest the Constitution comes to mentioning immigration is the word migration, and that is in the Migration and Importation Clause of Article 1, Section 9. That clause says the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress until the year 1808. That clause, though, even though it generally talks about migration of persons, is clearly is one of the clauses in the Constitution, including the 3/5 clause, that is really intended to be talking about slavery without mentioning the word slavery.
Oh, that's why I said the year 1808.
That's right. It prohibits
I
congressional
see.
regulation of slavery until the year 1808. And in fact, Congress did begin regulating the movement of slaves into the United States from foreign countries in 1808. But other than that, the only other mention of something that is related to immigration would be the naturalization clause.
Oh, how to become a citizen?
Right. It says that Congress has the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. So certainly Congress has the power to make citizens, that is to tell us who amongst the non-citizen population and under what conditions those non-citizens can become citizens. But that doesn't necessarily tell you that Congress has the power to control movement into the nation or exclusion from the nation.
Yeah, it's very vague with respect to those two areas you mentioned. This is on a bit of a tangent, but I just wanted to make sure that I understand this. The clause that you mentioned about slavery that prohibited Congress from making any laws about it until the year 1808, it was sort of set up to give Southerners sort of a compromise that here, sign on to our Constitution. This is a compromise. We won't do anything about slavery till 1808, right? That's sort of the backdrop to that.
That's right. And certainly this is not my area of expertise, but that is the commonly understood explanation for why that clause and other clauses like the 3/5 clause are in the Constitution. These were compromises necessary to get all of the states, including the slavery, the states in which slavery was quite important to their continued economic survival, and there was significant resistance to the Constitution without those forms of compromises in them, that those clauses were added to get those states on board.
I see. Thanks for explaining that. I was just curious. Let's get back to our regular programming here now. What is immigration federalism? I've heard this before.
Yeah, so immigration federalism is the term generally used within legal academic circles, but fundamentally it's just trying to describe the area of law and constitutional adjudication, which is trying to figure out what exactly is the room for states and localities to enact immigrant or immigration-related policies. So, for example, can Arizona create, as it did in 2010, an omnibus enforcement law against unlawfully present non-citizens? Can California cities, on the other hand, can they have non-cooperation or sanctuary laws? So that all of those laws, and whether they're legal or not legal, those fall underneath the broad umbrella of immigration federalism.
Is the term immigration federalism and its sort of related research, is this only in the academic arena, or is this real litigation going on that goes up to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, this is very much both an area of academic study, but certainly on the ground, this is something, especially over the last 2 or 3 decades, has been an active area of both policymaking and litigation. And so on the one hand, you can think of, just thinking about the last couple decades and even the last several years, there have been laws that, for example, provide driver's licenses to any resident of a state, regardless of their immigration status, provide access to higher education or education financing, regardless of immigration status. And then you have, on the other hand, laws that engage states and localities in immigration enforcement that might, for example, prohibit non-citizens or landlords from renting to non-citizens, attempt to keep unlawfully present non-citizens out of public schooling. All of those are examples of laws that have been enacted in the last 10 to 15 years and have been under significant litigation in federal courts.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. So that's sort of an indirect way of regulating immigration without really having laws specifically on it. So let's get into this history. We'll be right back after a short break to talk about states' participation in immigration legislation and enforcement since our founding. We'll be right back.